Hello, I'm Ariana Welch, and this is my video project for my marine biology class through the University of Maryland Global Campus. So this project is based off of the scientific method and a topic that we were able to choose, showcasing the steps of the scientific method and how we came to our own conclusions and made our own hypothesis. So with all that being said, the topic that I picked was the evolution of sharks. I know, it sounds insane to try and do an experiment-based scientific method project on the evolution of sharks. However, when I was researching our reading materials in the class on scientific method, I did find that it's not only for experiments, but it's also for observations. So the observations that you make, the research that you find, the data you analyze, and the conclusions that you come to also work in the scientific method, even if you can't necessarily do a physical experiment on it. So with all that being said, my topic is the evolution of sharks, and specifically the evolutionary progress of prehistoric sharks versus that of the more modern sharks. I know, it's a lot. So step one of the scientific method is make observations. With all that, I thought about what I knew about sharks, what I had seen about sharks, and what I have learned about sharks before. The first thing that I thought of was that sharks have been around forever. Sharks have been around for a really long time. In fact, in my research, I found out that sharks have been around longer than trees. So that's basically forever. With sharks being around so long, that shift from the more commonly known early sharks like the megalodons to those great whites and tiger bull sharks that we see in the waters today has, no pun intended, been murky. Sharks seem to have gotten smaller, lighter, and faster. And that, coupled with the knowledge that sharks have been around forever, so therefore their evolution has taken a long time, which means that it has gone pretty slowly. So I figured that the adaptations that sharks have are fairly important and advantageous to them in their environment because they haven't changed a whole lot since that original state of shark. So I figured that overall they would be more efficient today than they were in the past, or else they wouldn't have changed at all if they were, the perfect species, the best that they could have been. So step two in the scientific method is proposing a hypothesis. And I wanted to encompass in my hypothesis how I felt about the evolution of sharks and also what I thought the most successful evolutionary period was with sharks, whether that be modern or more prehistoric. So my hypothesis reads, I hypothesize that these evolutionary shifts happened slowly over millions of years and that sharks today are more successful creatures than they were pre-evolution. And this is really where I want to focus, that sharks today are more successful than they were prehistorically or with more evolution, or less evolution, sorry. And that really comes from the knowledge that evolution serves to better advance a species by keeping those most advantageous adaptations and working the creature themselves, into the best position for future success. So, with all that said, and contemplating what I knew about sharks, what I had learned about sharks, and my own hypothesis, I wanted to make a timeline of sharks that would show how they evolved. Therefore, I came up with the evolutionary timeline of sharks. This is my trusty sketch pad, my visual aid that I'm using to kind of use that experimental component of the scientific method, even though it is observation-based in my case. So, the evolutionary timeline of sharks. To begin with, it's pretty much figured across the board that sharks descended from these tiny little leaf-shaped fish that had no eyes, no fins, and no bones. And these fish eventually evolved into the two main groups of fish that we see today, the bony fish and the cartilaginous fish. So that's fish with bones or fish with cartilage. And as we know, sharks are those fish with cartilage. And that starts us off at the Paleozoic era. I'm quite the artist. So these are what the sharks looked like in the very beginning stages. And this right here was basically the most common shark that you would see. This period saw the evolution of life from those single-celled organisms to the more bony fish and sharks. And during this time, there was a rapid increase in the number of shark species. And this is because, they're coming out and they're quickly evolving different, they'll shoot off a horn here or a bump on their back because they're still trying to kind of figure out what exactly works best for them. So there was this golden age of the Carboniferous era where sharks would just evolve these super weird and crazy appendages. So that's like this pointy unicorn nose that the shark has, or this bump on his back that this shark evolved. And it's important to note that none of the sharks that lived in this era are around today. However, all modern sharks are evolved from them. So that's kind of the two-sided coin toss as far as this era goes in looking into which era of shark is better. None of them lived to see further progress. However, all of the modern sharks came from them. Next, we have the Mesozoic era. So this is, 250 to 65 million years ago. And this is what these sharks look like. And as you can tell, I said that they were really big because that is the standout about these sharks. Some of the sharks from the Paleozoic period did survive into the Mesozoic era. However, this is the Jurassic period where the dinosaurs lived. So there was another rapid increase in the number of shark species. And, due to this, because these sharks had to compete with dinosaurs, they were super big and super able to eat a dinosaur. So that is one adaptation that they had, was that they got really big. I, in my research, didn't find this to be like a particularly good adaptation going forward because it, the bigger you get, the slower you are, the more noticeable you are in the water, that type of thing. But during the time, it was definitely a necessary adaptation since dinosaurs. And then next we have the Cenozoic era, and that's 65 million years ago to present day. So that includes both the Megalodon and the great white shark. As you can see, the Megalodon is super big while the great white is smaller. So this is the period where modern sharks and those toothed whales like the killer whale have continued to flourish at the top of their food chain. Fun fact, the hammerheads were the last of the shark species to evolve, and they did so during this era. It's important to note that while the Megalodon was in this era, it evolved out. So they are extinct. There are no more Megalodons. So with that knowledge in mind, I think it's fair to say that the adaptations that they had of being bigger, they, ruled the ocean and all of that. But as time went on, that became less and less advantageous to them in their evolution. And now we have sharks like the great white around who are smaller, more aggressive, more of that ambush predator mentality. They're faster, they're sleeker, they're slicker in the water. The way their gills work and the way that they can swim is overall more effective than the older sharks like the Megalodon. So it's interesting to note that sharks did shrink and then they got bigger and then they shrunk again. So there's been a lot of back and forth with shark evolution, even though, when you look at it overall, they don't look a whole lot different than they did when they first evolved from those spiny fish. But the evolutionary adaptations that they do have are really effective and really important. And that is something that has allowed them to survive all 5 major extinction events that we have had. And that is only really a feat that sharks and those marine reptiles can attest to due to those adaptations. So step 4 is analyzing the data. So after all of that we learned and read, we found that modern sharks are in fact sleeker and faster than prehistoric sharks. I also discovered that sharks are potentially the most anatomically advanced in the department of jaw vertebrae. So the way that they have evolved their jaws is the most advanced out of all the other vertebrae. And that shows that, if they have evolved that much and that advanced in the jaw capacity, then the sharks today with those adaptations would be more successful than those sharks in the past who didn't have those adaptations. And then also the loss of bones, those original bony fish sharks have led them to be faster, lighter, and more flexible, which makes them a more effective predator overall. But I do think that one thing that's important to touch on is that even with all of the modern adaptations that sharks have now and that they have developed, they still repopulate slowly. They are super slow at having babies and giving birth and mating, which, regardless of all of these adaptations, if you can't repopulate yourself at a good pace, then if a threat comes along, is that the best adaptation to have? So, with all that being said, sharks have proven time and time again that through not only their diversity, but their survival adaptations, being able to explore those different parts of the watering column, whether that be the deepest, darkest parts of the sea or a shallow ocean or a river system, and also eating wide arrays of food, everything from plankton to whales. They are more than capable of rolling with whatever environmental changes get thrown at them. And step 5, which is state conclusions. So my conclusion after all of that was that after analyzing the observations and data, I conclude that modern sharks are more anatomically and environmentally successful than the prehistoric sharks. So that being said, basically covers all of that information that we learned, how the sharks moved through the different eras and the adaptations that they gained or that they lost, or what worked and what didn't, what survived today. I think it's proven and fair to say that modern sharks are a more effective and successful predator than the prehistoric sharks were, due to, the steps that I took of the scientific method. However, I feel like there's always a however with science. It's never just, oh, they did it, they're great. Sharks are still extremely vulnerable to factors like overfishing, climate change, and human environmental threats. So even with all of these, anatomic and environmental adaptations that sharks have been able to use and overcome, there's still no match to the threat of human damage on their ecosystem, of, pollution, overfishing, stuff like that. Sharks are still super susceptible to. So even though they are more anatomically adapted and a better, more scientifically effective species than they were at the time, they are still struggling due to the new challenges that we are presenting as a human race. So So that is my presentation on the evolution of sharks, modern sharks versus prehistoric sharks. I definitely found a lot of value in using the scientific method and following those steps, even in an observation-based project like this one was. It definitely forced me to look a little deeper and examine the data in a way that I could prove my hypothesis or find out that my hypothesis wasn't quite right. In this case, I think that the data definitely proved my hypothesis to be true, but I know that because of the steps that I took in the scientific method. Thank you so much for listening, for giving me this time. I hope that you are happy and healthy at home, and I hope you learned something new in this project. Thank you so much. Bye.